All right. I'll have chat up so I can monitor that as well. Let's talk about how you can make the most of today. There's a school that I work with, and their high school came up with this visual for trying to teach their students how to behave professionally when participating in online learning with guest speakers. That was the target. But then they realized actually it should be similar skills if the students were participating online in their Zoom classes, for example. So I've been sharing this as sort of a meta example. It works well for us today, but also just to show you how schools quickly adapted, having clear expectations, rules, routines for virtual learning. So if I was going to focus on one thing here, let's kind of be committed to the mission for the day. Commitment to mission is one of their expectations. But for us today, for you, your goal is to think over the next hour, what am I doing? How am I moving my school forward with this work? So just lean into the conversation, participate in dialogue. I'll give you chances to comment and chat. I'd love for you to do that and contribute. And by doing that, I think you should be able to leave with lots of different ideas for what you can do and what's next for your school. Okay. So let's start with this. It's always a good reminder, and this is updated regularly because I can't stop ever updating anything, but go ahead and read this definition on your own. I've been doing this work for over 20 years. I worked at a residential school. That's where I started my work implementing PBIS. And I should show the history of the definitions of this. I should go back in time and try to capture all the different definitions we've used. But I see this all the time, and I always have takeaways from it. So here's my question to you. Looking at this definition, what's anything new to you in this definition? Anything that stands out to you? I'm sure you've read many definitions of it, but what is sort of sparking your interest or your thoughts right now as you read this version? You can just go ahead and throw your voice in the room if you want, or use chat. I'd like for everybody to respond if you could in one way.
I don't know if this is really new, but this something that always strikes me is where it says supports consistent adult behavior.
Yeah, great. Who else? Oh, Jessica said wellness as well. Yep. Anybody else? Okay, I see continuous improvement as an example. This is a life's work. The climate and culture of your school is not something you're going to work on for the next month, and then you're good. And then when you retire, you reflect back on the summer and say, that's when we really did a great job with climate and culture. It's a life's work to constantly focus on these important skills of your adults and your students and the climate itself. So continuous improvement has to be the focus. Anybody else want to come off mute and put your voice in the room?
I'll come off mute. I was just thinking that the flexibility piece it's been there to accommodate the context, whether it's your local context or the population that you're serving. But also I think it's relevant when thinking about the different models that our schools have been in, whether some of us have been fully in person or fully virtual, or what type of hybrid model we've been teaching in. I think that context is important to consider right now too. So that's just what kind of struck me this time.
This must be a gifted group, because that's definitely a word that was added. Casey, maybe you're just gifted, but I'll say the whole group is. The wellness that was added in the definition as I was tweaking it. What happened is our Midwest team, we are responsible for doing the internal evaluation of the entire center itself, which is just pretty much a data grind. We just are constantly working through the data, and we're trying to produce reports. And one of the reports was a big annual report we had to send to the US Department of Ed. And then they sent a response back with sort of their analysis. And in their analysis, they gave the definition of PBIS, and that was the language they used in a way that's flexible enough to accommodate local and culturally responsive context, needs, and values. And the best part is, I thought, well, I think we probably wrote to them our definition, but the way that they worded it back to us really stood out to me. So I grabbed that as well. So I appreciate you guys seeing that one too. So let's think about then, what do we mean when we say multi-tiered? Again, another conversation that you should be really versed in, but I never rest with the best ways to define it. I was trying to think of the simplest words to use, or the simplest way to define what does multi-tiered mean. So let's start with tier 1. What are the practices all staff use with all students in order to achieve your school-wide expectations and the social emotional behavior success of students and staff? So that's tier 1. What are all of our adults doing with all of our students? The specific practices we put in place that defines our school. Tier 2 then is, how do you intensify those tier 1 practices? So a higher frequency of the practice, more structure for that practice, or higher rates of feedback for the students about the skills related to that practice in order to achieve the same goal. The goal doesn't change. The goal is, at our school, we are respectful, we are responsible, and we are ready to learn. That's our expectation. So the goal is the same for tier 2. And tier 3 then is, you're going to individualize those practices further based on what that student's functions are and their specific needs in order to achieve the same goal. So that's how I like to think about those tiers. And when I put it in the academic example, the simplest way I can think of is, we have our math curriculum. So the next unit, 3-week unit in math, we have specific objectives to achieve with our students, and we're going to use our lesson plans for the next 3 weeks to get there. That's tier 1. I have 5 students in my class who are struggling with some of the basic concepts. So after I teach all the students in the class the lesson for the day, I pull those 5 students aside and I reteach them in small group, the same lesson. That's tier 2. That would be increased frequency, getting an additional dose of the same tier 1 information, but now they're going to get it in a small group. So it's a little bit more structure and an additional dose. And then I have 2 students who are going to need individual support for that lesson. So after we do the small group, everybody's working, I'm going to check in on those 2 students and check for their specific understanding and give them feedback about how they're doing with that lesson every single day. So every lesson, I have to make sure I check on Heather and Laura specifically to make sure to see where they are on the content. Whereas from a lot of the students, I'm giving them the tier 1 instruction and I'll check on them periodically, but I don't have to make sure I always check on them. That's an example of an academic structure. Behavior would be the same way. So I hope that's a good way to think about these tiers. The other thing that's always great to point out, I'm going to ask if you guys have any thoughts about this visual. Raise your hand if you've seen this before. A few of you. Okay, great. And thanks for sharing your cameras, by the way, for those of you who are sharing your cameras. That's really helpful. If you have 500 students in your school, you have 500 versions of this triangle. So it's like a snowflake. Everyone is different. And every single student has something that goes up and down this triangle. So this is student 322. You know who he is. Great kid. We love him. Student 322 is with the tier 1 supports we give them in school, is showing success with adult relationships, peer relationships, problem solving, anxiety, anger management, asking for assistance, and working independently. And with the tier 1 instructional supports, showing success with PE, science, band, and math. This student needs additional instruction and support in the area of distracting others. And they get that with a bunch of other students in a pro-social skills group. And then this student needs individualized instruction for attendance skills and in English. Every single student has a profile like this. Is this student a tier 1 student? Is this a tier 2 student? Is this a tier 3 student?
It looks mostly like tier 1 to me. He's got mostly, he has a lot of really good skills.
Yep. Anybody else?
To me, it looks like maybe he's a AIS and English ELA student. Other than that, tier 1.
Okay.
Isn't the whole kind of idea that we all need tier 1 supports and tier 2 supports and tier 3 supports in different areas?
Mm-hmm. When you think about defining your students from a context of the skills and support that they need and they get, put the skill first. So let's think about students instead of saying, I have a tier 1 student or I have a tier 2 student, or I have a tier 2 staff member or a tier 3 staff member or a colleague or a tier 3 wife, or that was uncalled for. Let's put the skill first. So this is a student who needs tier 3 support for English. This is a student who needs tier 1 support for math. They need tier 2 support for distracting others. It's the skill that's in the tier, not the student. And that's really critical. So all of you are the same. If you think about your emotional skills, your academic skills, your physical skills, or your professional skills, anything in your life's domains, what's an example of something that what's a skill that you have that you maintain through tier 1 support? So let's use chat. Be so bold as to share something that, thank you, Amy. I was hoping it was gonna be laundry or map reading skills or what else? Asking for help. Getting to work on time, good example. Let's use getting to work on time. There are, how many folks do we have? We have 46 folks today who are in. Do you think all 46 of us getting to work on time is a tier 1 skill? That just based on the general expectation, we're able to all get to work on time? I will bet out of the 46 of us here, I'm gonna go with at least 5, maybe 8, might need additional support for getting to work on time. I will also bet out of this group, maybe 2 to 3 need tier 3 support for getting to work on time. Is it because you don't know the expectation? Is it because you don't know when school starts? Is it a matter of if I just said tomorrow, I want everybody here, boom, you know the expectation, 100% of you will never have a problem getting to work on time again. For those who that's an area that they need help with, can I just snap my fingers and say, now you know, do it? That is the mentality we often have with our students. Why are you punching people in the face? I think we've talked about use your words instead of punching people in the face. But if the student, if that's the skill that they have, if physical aggression is how they're getting their function and their needs met, and they've learned that that's working for them, simply knowing the difference or being told what it is does not mean they now have the skill. It's something that they're going to need probably individualized support for. Because frankly, if you guys don't know, if you're frustrated with somebody else, punching them in the face turns out to be very effective. it often gets you the space you want from that person. I'm so glad this is being recorded. Don't use that against me in the future. Turns out it's a very effective way sometimes to get the space you want from another person. There's also a lot of problems with it too. So what we need to do then is we need to recognize that that student, that's an area where they might need tier 3 support in, specific individualized instruction to replace that skill. But that student also has great competence in saying kind words about others, a pro-social skill that they can do with just the tier 1 support they get. All right. So how come PBIS is still around after all these years? This is critical, because whether it was a big focus on bullying prevention and national research 10 years ago, or whether it's prioritization right now on mental health and wellness or equity, how come while the focus of education is constantly shifting and pointing in different directions, PBIS is still relevant? And if I had to simplify the definition, these were the fewest words I could find to do so. The simplest approach to this work is it organizes your school to achieve outcomes by understanding your data, providing a continuum of practices, how adults interact with students, and supporting staff through the systems of your school. So whether you need to focus on the wellness of your adults, the mental health of your students, the pro-social skills in your school, equitable outcomes, like I said, bullying, tardiness, crises in the community, whatever the focus is for your school, we're going to use these 4 components to organize ourselves and say, so where do we go? How are we doing and where do we go from here? And what we find is schools, and maybe your schools with a history of doing this work, have gotten pretty good at organizing some of the practices. So we take behavioral lesson plans, and that's tier 1. And then we look at maybe wraparound or other tier 3 supports that are oftentimes like FBA, BIP, mandated through federal law. Schools are pretty good actually at providing tier 3 supports, because we're required to do that. And we oftentimes have something for tier 1. A lot of times there's this big gap between the two. So you start learning about PBIS and other multi-tiered systems of support. And then we say, okay, let's get a tier 2 system in place so we can stop individualizing everything when there's challenges. And the schools start to then look at, okay, where does tier 2 go? The challenge we have historically, though, is this is not all that's going on in your school. Schools also do all of this work on the side too. And far too often, these are separate initiatives and they're not thought about in one system of support. So the triangle is about the practices that you're engaging with your students. How do you teach them the skills you want them to have? And any social, emotional, behavioral, wellness, mental health support for your school, all of those supports, we need to think about in terms of aligning them. They have to come together. So you know how those supports are built out and support each other at tier 1. And then we know how to magnify them or expand upon them or provide additional doses at tier 2 and at tier 3. The challenge we have in schools then, without putting everything together, is we have these siloed initiatives, and that's frustrating for staff. And so, I think we have a lot of school leaders here today. The real work of alignment should be at district level. It's a big ask to go to individual schools and say, we're going to implement restorative practices, make that fit in everything else that you do. That really should be a discussion at the district level before restorative practices are brought into the district to say, we have data that shows we have a need for restorative practices. This is how we're going to fit that within our multi-tiered system of support, and so how it complements the other initiatives we have. Or as a district, we decided to use second step because of these data points for curriculum. This is how it's going to fit in what we do for tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. That's where the conversation should be had. But if it's not being had at your district, then we need to have it at the school level team. Otherwise, your staff are going to get frustrated and things are not going to sustain over time. So let's think about everything as within this framework for alignment. All right, so I've talked quite a bit. I've shared a little bit of the background here. The purpose, of course, for today is to say, how do we start planning for next year based on the data that we have? So could we just start out by celebrate a highlight or two? Would everybody use chat? Just in a few words, what's a strong component of your PBIS system that's in place right now? All right, I'll give you guys about a minute. Please use chat. This is a great list. Makes me want to visit your schools. We found that schools that were implementing PBIS with fidelity before the pandemic fared pretty well in quickly adapting and adjusting the supports in their schools as a result of the pandemic. Schools that were not implementing at fidelity before the of tier 1, according to the TFI, before the pandemic, struggled because things really weren't in place. They weren't really sure, and maybe PBIS dropped off a little bit. And then the third group are schools that weren't implementing at all and thought, hey, there's a pandemic, let's start PBIS. Turns out that's a bad idea. Not the best time to take on a new initiative that's all about constant organizational change. But what I'm seeing here in chat, some of these being, these strengths, I'm guessing for some of you, these might have been strengths that you had prior to the pandemic. That's just my gut. I could be wrong if you're newer to implementing here. All right, that was the easy one. What's challenging you about your PBIS system? Same thing, let's use chat. And then whatever you write, you're gonna need to keep that in mind as we go through the next couple slides here. Oh, there's a theme. Definitely have some themes with adult buy-in. If adults weren't in our schools, it'd be so easy to do this work. So let's keep that in mind. Data collection, consistent sustainability has come up multiple times. How do we keep this work going? What's the fidelity of our work? Buy-in and staff consistency. Classroom teachers want everyone else to take care of academic, emotional, behavioral supports. High schools. I feel like there's quite the theme for high schools here. What's with high schools? I say that. I don't know why I said it that way. I know what's with high schools. They're complex organizations. They're bigger. It takes more time to get more adults on the same page. And you have to probably spend more time with the rationale for the work. Sometimes high school staff need to be a little bit more convinced. I mean, don't get me wrong. We should just tell them what to do and they should do it, because that's oftentimes, ironically, what adults think of students. I told you what I expect of you, now just do it. If only that worked with adults too. All right, so we just had some really great reflection on what's challenging you in your PBIS system. This is what I want you to do. Keep what you wrote in mind. You have your comment. Now, for those of you who had systemic responses, a couple of you were talking about using data for tier 2 and tier 3, which is great. You'll see the connection anyway. But I want you to be able to think about if you are going to action plan around the area that you need the most help in, the one that you just identified. Where along this continuum do you think you would start to problem solve? Is it with the teaming, like who's in charge and making decisions about the PBIS work? Is it about clarity of the vision and expectations that all adults are on the same page, or how we define those in our teaching matrix? Is it our lesson planning for achieving those expectations and those rules and routines? Oops. Is it getting all of our adults to give feedback to students about what we just taught and how they're doing with those skills? Is it adults consistently responding to problem behavior in the way that the team wants them to? Or is it in the data around this work? Would somebody be willing to come off of mute and maybe tell us what was the challenge that they commented on, and then maybe where it might fit along this continuum of implementation?
I will. I'm Cindy Hay from Red Creek.
Thanks, Cindy.
So our problem, especially at the high school level, is adult buy-in. So
Okay.
I would say it's vision and expectations, but we've kind of done that over and over.
Mm-hmm.
So we're already starting a plan for next year, bumping down to, I guess, a system for teaching. And we are creating a student-led circle time. And I'll be posting a position for a faculty leader for those students that will train over the summer and then be in charge of those circles starting as soon as school opens at the high school level, so that we get that consistent daily circle, and we have an advisory period for it.
Okay. So it's interesting, you said vision, so we have adult buy-in is a challenge. Do we have clarity on the vision expectations? And sometimes it feels like maybe you feel like you're having that conversation a lot, but are we sort of stuck a little bit with, we just can't, talking about it and thinking about it and working on it is one thing, but believing it and following it and doing it, that's maybe the gap right there a little bit. Okay.
Brian, it's Amy from Waterloo. I also
Amy.
chatted about staff buy-in, but I kind of think that it goes into like the system for feedback and acknowledging. So for us, we have a ticket system, which kind of broke down this year just because our original principal didn't want us giving out tickets and such. Anyway, some teachers still don't really like the whole ticket thing. They look at it as what's one more thing we got to do, and we got to count them, and they got to get prizes and so I think it kind of goes and it leads into that system for feedback and acknowledging. So they're not acknowledging as much as they should because they don't want to deal with the tickets.
Sure.
And then it kind of moves into preventing and responding to inappropriate behavior. So I think it's more so the preventing part, where we have the classroom teachers doing second step in their classrooms, all of them. And we're a K2 building. So that's great on one hand. However, I think along with that buy-in, I think that's part of our breakdown, is where they don't act so much on preventing it and responding well enough to it and doing what they're supposed to do, is reteaching the expectations and those kinds of things. So that's kind of where we're at. And like I said, too, they want everyone else to fix and take care of all those things. So it's all the intervention people. Oh, well, she can't read. So, she's got to go see this one. Or, he has social emotional problems. Oh, you have to go see the counselor. So just really looking at making like the whole classroom surrounding the student needs. I don't know.
That's an interesting point, because we painted ourselves into a corner historically with the referral idea.
Mhm.
Who's the person that can help with this student? Because my job right now is to teach science, and this student has a hard time keeping their voices to themselves. Everything comes out, and I need someone that can help this student. And what we learned through the multi-tier system of support logic, the tier 1 logic, is that's all of us. That is very much our jobs. And referring out is actually it's kind of faulty logic. It really should be pulling in support for me as the adult, so I know how to support the student. It's my job to build social, emotional, behavioral skills of the students so they can be successful, and then they can show that success academically. And that's a challenge. It's a challenge to get adults to buy into that. So when people call my hotline, I have a red phone and it rings and somebody says, help, we're using these tickets, we're making it rain tickets and these aren't working. That tells me a lot of things. The first thing is, oftentimes the work, this life's work of building the climate and the culture for school, when it's falling apart, gets reduced down to, we have a ticket system. And we think that that is the work. And so people say, if that's not working, what do we do? And that's system for feedback and acknowledging sometimes. You don't have to have tickets or a token economy, but you have to have a method by which adults are interacting with students and giving them feedback about their skills at a 5-to-1 strength-based ratio. That's what that box means. And what happens is if somebody calls and says, I don't have a phone, but if they did, this is what's not working for us, I go backwards in this process and I say, okay, well, what are you giving feedback about? What are the lesson plans and what are you teaching? And if we don't have those in place, or if we're not sure, those lesson plans are building on what expectations that all the adults understand and share. And if we're a little confused there, I go back to who's making the decisions. Do the staff feel like their voice is heard? Because what Amy just described of, we had a ticket process in place, but it fell out of favor. The social validity of it was questioned by our building administrator, is what I think I heard. Then that goes all the way back to teaming and leadership. Who's making decisions? Do we have equal voice there? And are we deciding as a group how to represent all the adults in our building? So many people commented about high schools. That is just as critical. High schools are bigger organizations. It means you need more of the adults involved in the decision-making. Otherwise, you have a small group of people trying to steer the ship for a lot of adults. And then what that means is fidelity is going to be a challenge because not enough adults are involved in the ongoing climate and culture conversation. So another way that I look at this is, if I was talking to your teachers and I said, here are the questions I want you to ask of your own building, because this is supposed to represent you. So here are the questions that I would have each teacher ask, and can they answer? So for teaming and leadership, as a teacher, who represents my voice on the team? My job as a teacher is to implement the decisions of the team. Like that's the role. Team-based decision-making. If I'm not on the team, my job is to implement the decisions. To be comfortable with that, I want somebody on the team to represent my voice, though. So who is that person that represents my voice on the team? What are the 3 to 5 squad expectations that we have? Do I know them? Do I use them every day? Are those the words I use to define what my expectations are in my classroom? What do those expectations look like? Again, I'll go back to high school. And when I have students in the science lab, what does it look like? When I'm standing in my doorway and students are passing through the passing periods, what do those expectations look like? When class is starting in the first 4 minutes, because we're doing bell-to-bell teaching, what do those expectations look like? So what does it look like for me? What are the lesson plans that I'm using to teach those expectations in all these settings? How do I give feedback the same way my other colleagues do? When a student needs more support, let's think about the language there. When a student needs more support, how do I respond? Let's flip it. It's not when a student isn't behaving, whether that is the issue or not, or a student is struggling with their emotional skills, but if a student needs more support than what I'm already providing to this point, how do I respond? And then what's my responsibility for data? What am I contributing so the team can make decisions and continue to support this process. So everybody here's completed the TFI for their schools, Lori, is that right? So I'll take those same ideas, and when we look at the TFI, that is one way for us to say, are we doing these things the right way? The way that the research says, if we do them, we're expecting to see the outcomes associated with PBIS over the last 20 years. That is the foundation of the TFI for Tier 1. So one way to look at each of these components are to say, okay, well, where do those TFI elements fit? And you can see teaming and leadership is a big one. Everything goes back there. Who's on the team? Do they represent the voices of the school? Does the team operate in an efficient and effective way? Are they just getting together to plan parties? Or do they get together and talk about what are we going to do about the south wing of our school? Those teachers are nuts. Or are they efficient? Do they use data every single time they have a team meeting? Do they document the decisions they're making? Do they monitor them? Do they have implementation plans? Are they able to do that in really efficient short periods of time? So that's team operating procedures. And then you'll also see that's where professional development is determined, 1.7. Faculty involvement, 1.10. And student family community involvement, 1.11. So that's where that work is all started, is with that teaming and leadership. And so when we struggle, I think Cindy said, you've done the work on vision and expectations. And we're having a hard time getting it to go from there. Then I go backwards a step, actually. I say, okay, well, who's making the decisions about the vision and expectation? What's the gap in understanding? And are the teachers' voices heard? Because maybe it goes back to the conversation at the teaming leadership level on understanding the gap and the buy-in to the growth mindset that we expect in our school, if that's your example. Another way to look at this, and I'll reference this slide kind of at the end, because I want to give you some thoughts on, okay, so if we did the TFI, so we have an idea on where we are with our fidelity, and if you're 80%, that's awesome. You still have work to do, because Tier 1, the work of Tier 1 never stops. And if you're 20%, that's awesome. Transition's getting there. Where do you need to go from here? So we sort of flipped the script a little bit and reversed it and started asking these questions and use this type of example to say, so where do I need to go? So it's another way of going back to what questions should your teachers be asking of you? That was the slide a couple slides ago. This is maybe a little bit more for the team. Who's responsible for the planning, implementation, monitoring of the school's climate and culture? That's your team. That's 1.1. So if you don't feel like you can answer that question in the spirit in which it's written, go back to that definition and say, what else can we do for 1.1? Even if we already gave ourselves a 2 in that area, is it really meeting our needs? Do we have enough of the voices represented on our staff? Are we structured in a way that's efficient and effective? So this is a good reference slide. I'll let you guys come back to this. And now that I say that, let me see if I can pop this into chat. I just dropped in chat. I think that link should be live, and you could open that and then click download and pull all these slides down. Should have done that at the start. All right, some of you talked about multiple tiers. So here's something I want to consider. When I talked about what is Tier 2 and what is Tier 3, you can't do Tier 2 unless you have, Tier 2 is more of Tier 1, more structure, higher doses of feedback. You can't do more of something if you don't have the first thing in place. So we always go back to Tier 1 as the start, but this is brand new research, a multi-year study of over 700 schools. And what they were looking at is, what's the timing for implementation? What's the best suggestions we have? It's not perfect, but what's the best thoughts we have about timing? And what are some key takeaways? So it was published, it was just published about a month or two ago. And I'm working with the researchers on taking what they've learned and putting it into terms that you guys can make decisions on. And here are just some of the key takeaways. Tier 1 gets started with our structures and our systems and our practices. You're already doing a lot of Tier 1 work anyway, even if you're not at Fidelity. But how do we organize ourselves, getting our practices in place? And as we're implementing those, we're at some point going to get to Tier 1 Fidelity. That's 70% on the TFI. Tier 2, the work of Tier 2 can start before that. But what we're trying to coordinate is, if our Tier 1 practices get to Fidelity, now we can magnify those practices at Tier 2. We can repeat those practices for students who need more Tier 2 support for specific targets and skills. So that's where maybe Tier 2 practices, if you already have them in place, you're going to reboot them. You're going to get them organized right around the same time that we're trying to hit Fidelity of Tier 1. And that's also where maybe we're going to start to organize our Tier 3 readiness. It's important to note Tier 3 is done all the time because that's federally mandated that you have individualized support for students. But how it's organized, is it efficient, and does it build on Tier 1 and Tier 2? That's this readiness work that might start at Tier 3. What happens in schools is we don't get to Fidelity of Tier 1 and we start implementing Tier 2 practices. And that is a little bit of a challenge in the logic. How do you try to do Tier 2? How do you do more of a practice that you're not already doing at Fidelity at Tier 1? So I go back to that math academic example. If I'm not teaching my whole, if I'm at my lesson plans for the next 3 weeks for this math unit, and I'm not teaching the lesson plans correctly as they're intended to be taught, how is it helpful to pull a small group of students aside then and teach them the same lesson incorrectly again? And that's what we do for Tier 2 in social emotional behavior supports. We don't have all of our adults consistently implementing Tier 1 the way we want. So we say, well, but let's do Tier 2 because these kids need more support, but they're not getting the basic structure. There's nothing to magnify. So that's where we want you to think about the importance of constantly boosting the work that all of our staff are doing. For those of you who are implementing Tier 2 and Tier 3, just some quick thoughts about the role of the Tier 2 team. What that team's job is not to talk about individual students, not to say, okay, we have Tier 1 in place, good. Let's talk about Lori. She needs Tier 2 support. What should we do for Lori? That's not the purpose of your Tier 2 team. That team's job is to focus not on individual students, but on the Tier 2 interventions themselves, and to really hit these marks. What are the interventions we want in Tier 2? What are the boosters that we're going to have that complement our Tier 1 work? How do we connect that to the Tier 1 work? How do we make sure that those interventions are being done the way they're supposed to be done? So our team's job is to monitor the fidelity of the Tier 2 interventions. Then we monitor the use, which means how many students are using the Tier 2 interventions. And then we monitor the outcomes. And by asking ourselves these questions in our Tier 2 team meetings, what we're focusing on is the intervention itself. If any of these things are not in place for intervention, then that's the work of Tier 2. Hey, we're doing check in, check out, but we're not, our last fidelity check indicated we're only about 50% correct in the way we're doing it. Let's focus on the fidelity and how do we boost that? What do we have to do with our staff? So that's some quick tips about moving up the tiers and what you can think about for Tier 2. So let me give you some ideas for what you can do next after this. You're all in different spots with implementation. You have your TFI. I showed you a little bit of a map. But I think for each of you, for your schools, you probably need to go your direction for, as you think about where do we go from here. So how do we get ourselves organized? At the start of today's call, I said schools that were implementing PBIS with Fidelity pre-pandemic turned out that they were able to use PBIS pretty effectively to address the changing needs of their schools as a result of the pandemic. But that's a process that you probably need to think about every school year anyway, or if there's a disruption. So what I want you to think about as you're planning for next school year is it's a new school year. Let's go back to the basics and make sure we just check where we're at for these items. So for teaming and leadership, do we need to revisit who's on the team? Are all of our stakeholders represented? And are they trained to do the work of tier 1? Are the meetings efficient and effective? And is there a shared action plan? We were swimming along just fine with our school, and then there's a global pandemic. And now we need to go to students learning from home, and we have mental health issues, and we have adults stressed out, and teachers need to learn new skills. Everything just shifted. Let's start with, okay, so who's making decisions for our school? Do we have the voices represented? Maybe it was a time to bring in some new voices on the team and get folks trained. And what does it mean to do MTSS, for example? Or maybe we realized, hey, you know what's a tier 1 need now? Mental wellness of all of our students. It wasn't before. Well, it was, but we didn't realize it. So let's make sure our tier 1 team has that perspective represented. Let's bring in some community supports who are going to join our tier 1 team for the mental wellness perspective of our curriculum. After you say, is our teaming in place, what we need for next year, do our squad expectations still apply? I don't suggest changing our expectations each year. I mean, they should be consistent with your mission and your vision. But every once in a while, you realize these are kind of outdated for us. Our vision, our mission of our school is not what it was 10 years ago when we originally came up with our expectations. So let's make sure our 3 to 5 squad expectations we're still committed to those. But what you should consider every single year is, do the rules or the examples of those expectations, the norms, whatever you're going to call what you put in your teaching matrix, are those still relevant? That immediately changed last year. Respectful, responsible, and ready to learn were our expectations in our school, but responsible all of a sudden looked different when kids were learning from home. So we had to change what we put in the matrix for the rules and routines. We had to have an at-home learning routine, a getting on Zoom on time routine, and a how to be engaged in education virtually routine. Those were all new things we had to write, and they had to change what we had from the previous year. But those were the rules and routines. The expectations didn't change for us. We just had to apply them now to this new environment. And then with new rules and routines, what are the lesson plans? How do we teach the skill of getting to Zoom on time each day for my 2nd graders or my 11th graders? So what's the lesson plans the teachers are going to use to teach that? And how are we going to then encourage them and support them in those skills? How do we respond when students are not showing up, if that's the skill we're working on? That was a tier 1 issue for almost every school last year. And then what's the data that we're collecting to make these decisions? So this is a really good reference slide on it. I've connected, if you have to, unfortunately, you have to put it in this view to see, but again, those same TFI measures. So here's a reference that you can come back to if you want to think about getting ready for next year. This is the same reference I would use if you had a disruption in your community. So if, you know, next November, there's a community crisis, you have something that happens between police officers and residents of your community, and it impacts your community in a way, or your school has to be shut down for 2 weeks because we have a spike in coronavirus, or heaven forbid, there is a school shooting or something like that. These are you go back to, you have to start with, there's a disruption. Let's make sure we can start with these foundations. That was actually what this, before the pandemic, this logic was initially written following the school shootings in Florida. How do we have trauma in our communities. How do we go back to what are the core questions we need to ask to make sure we're ready and organized to address those needs of our communities? All right, so for some of you, you might feel like you're pretty strong here. Another activity that I would suggest that you could think about using your time for today would be to map what are the practices you have in place. Remember the triangle I showed that had every practice under the sun, from equity to bullying prevention to truancy to check in, check out, to all the things. And I said, get them all together and organized. Well, when I say get them together and organized, what I'm really saying is for your school leadership team, Do we know what all the interventions and practices are that we have? When's the last time we checked each of those for fidelity? If one practice is teachers should be using our Tiger tokens to give specific verbal praise to students about 10 times a day, when was the last time we checked to see, was that being done the way it's supposed to be done and the frequency? And then what's the student data we're trying to move based on that practice, and what's the data say about it? Talk about a life's work. This is not an easy table to fill in. But by pursuing the data in this table, it could really help you clarify, what do we need to focus on? Maybe lesson planning, maybe a second step. Somebody mentioned that. Perfect. When was the last time we checked the fidelity that teachers are using the lesson plans the way they're supposed, that they're teaching them at the frequency they're supposed to, and the way they're supposed to be taught? And what's the data say about those second step lesson plans? Did we do it because we're trying to reduce violence? Are we trying to increase the pro-social skills of our students? What's the data say? Doing this type of assessment for your school across the tiers can help you make decisions about what should we stop doing? What do we need to put more emphasis on? Or maybe what's the agenda for our tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3 teams? They need to go back and really boost something that we haven't checked the fidelity of in a while. And finally, my last suggestion, if you're looking for strategies for the rest of the day, if you pick, I'm gonna go back here. If you picked a practice, so one of our tier 1 practices is we want staff to greet students at the door every day for every period. And for the students who need who are getting tier 2 or tier 3 support for engagement at school, they must be greeted every day without fail. So I need to greet all of my students, but for Haley and Rebecca and Joe, I have to specifically make sure their names are said when I greet them. All right, that's a social skill of adults, but that's an engagement, a simple engagement. By the way, I'm not saying do this. I'm saying that's an example of what some schools might choose to do. So the greeting plan is one of our tier 1 interventions. And the tier 2 version of it is specifically saying to Sharon and Cassie and Joe, hey, Joe, great to see you. Glad you're in class today, as I greet him coming in the door. Whatever the practice is for your staff, think about, if it's not in place at fidelity, what is the team's plan to get it to fidelity? And here's an example of some things that schools often do to get a practice to fidelity. Our greeting practice is not being done consistently by all staff. So what should we do? Well, let's make sure we know the data we're looking at. What's the action plan to get this to fidelity? Let's have our staff assess. Are you using the greeting plan the way we want you to? We could do a peer observation plan. Okay, everybody, Laura's going to observe Melissa and Kathy's going to observe Dennis, and then you're going to flip. So here's an example. And when you think about what your plan includes, what I want you to keep in mind is this Joyce and Showers research. These are all important components of a plan to boost your staff competency and a skill. But know that we have to get to these items below that dotted line in order to actually get outcomes in our classrooms. So for example, you spent the last hour with me. Not a single thing is going to change for a single teacher in a single classroom yet, based on us talking for this hour. You're just getting information and ideas on how to think about your work. But having a keynote speaker doesn't really move the needle at all in the classroom. It can, though, help you come up with an action plan. And then from there, you can start to get some data from your staff. And these are all important components at the top of this line. But it's the items below the line that your team should help think about that can get you to actually staff using the practice with students the way you want them to. So 3 slides. I shared my slides with you. And when you think about where you want to go from here, the 3 slides I would consider would be slide 13. I should write this down. Slide 13, slide 22, and 13, sorry, there were 4, 19, 22, and 23. So I'm gonna show them quickly to you again. And I put the link that you can download. Simply ask, if you're really trying to get the fidelity of tier 1, asking yourself these questions and helping to organize, going back to the TFI, which are the items. So what does the TFI tell us? That's slide 13. Slide 19 is we're getting ready for next year. Maybe we're at fidelity. Let's just double check each of these components kind of in this order. Do we need to rethink our rules and our routines, for example, because kids are coming back to school, we're back in session. What does that look like for us? 22 is an audit of all of your interventions or your practices that are in place, including a fidelity check and what's the data we're trying to move. Why are you doing the intervention if you don't know what you're trying to get from it? Then the last one is if you have a specific practice you want to boost, what's the plan that your team's going to put together for it? And does it include components that have the biggest impact on changing adult practice? So those are the slide numbers. All right. So if you could take a minute and reflect in chat, and then I'll ask maybe a couple people to come off mute and share as well. But what have you heard today that's a takeaway from you? Something that either reinforces what you're thinking about this work, or maybe something new that's kind of challenging what you had thought about the work and where you're going from here. All right, please use chat, answer that question. Let's see what responses we have. Would anyone like to come off mute and maybe reiterate the point you made in chat or elaborate on it at all? Maybe anybody that was really inspired, wants to have a whole new outlook on life. Or if this depressed you, you can share your thoughts too. I'm open.
So, hi, Brian, it's Casey.
Hi.
Again, I'm challenged, like that idea of making a representative team and really ensuring that all those voices are heard. I think something that you said resonated with me about, a few positive people trying to like carry this workload and it doesn't go very far if we're not getting all of the voices. And I think sometimes it's just it's frightening to ask. Like we're always fearful to ask because some of the negative voices are much louder than the positive ones. But so I guess that's something that I struggle with, but I also see the importance of, and it's just a difficult balance.
When I worked at a residential school, and I left the school, this is decades ago, to get a master's degree. And when I came back during the 4 years I was gone, they brought in a whole new behavioral model to the residential school, and 80% of the staff were fired or quit, because the mentality was, we're going to do it a new way, get on or get out. And it always struck me, because I thought, if I was there during those 4 years, would I have been part of the 80%? I mean, statistically, yeah, I would have. And I loved the new model when I came back, but I don't know if I would have survived the transition, letting go of something I used to do. And I think about that a lot, because when we have, I mean, don't get me wrong, a curmudgeon who doesn't like children and should not be in education, it's going to be hard. I mean, there's only so much we can do, right? But if I'm trying to bring a bunch of adults along, it's a slower process, but I need them involved in order to get them to where we want to go as a group. And I think part of that is communicating that the purpose of the team is to collectively, with the adults and the stakeholders, decide what's the climate and culture we want, and how are we going to get it in a way that that reflects the dignity of the adult and the dignity of the child and the values of our school. And to do that, I need every adult involved. So if all the adults are involved, they're connected to the conversations that are taking place. It doesn't mean they're all there for every team. You do not want a team meeting with 20 people. Disaster. I used to do that. Doesn't work. But sub teams, people are helping, like you have representative voices, and the data teams working with these 5 staff members. The more the adults are involved, they're connected to decisions. And then when decisions come down from the team, they understood the genesis of it. They might not like it. We start to move as a group. And I'm always thinking high schools with that, especially. Not just high schools, but bigger organizations, you need more adults involved. The other example I want to share there is for check-in, check-out. There's good research that says if you don't have enough kids on check-in, check-out, you can't do it with fidelity. If I have 500 kids in my high school, I don't know how many, I don't know how big your schools are, 1,000 kids in my high school, and I have 10 on check-in, check-out for the next 8 weeks, how many adults are interacting with those kids? Hardly any. Not enough for all of the adults to understand that intervention. If I have 50 kids on check-in, check-out, every adult has to be using it, probably, because those kids are going to be in all of these classes. So all of the adults have to make sure that they're up to date on what that intervention is. So that actually the frequency of it reinforces the fidelity of it. It's a great, like another meta example of the teaming, that if I have more adults involved in the decision-making somewhere in the process, their feedback is heard and validated, then they're connected to the conversation, and then they're more likely to be able to implement the conversation. Otherwise, it just feels like, oh, that's the PBIS team. They work in that room. They do their little work with the tickets. I'm teaching science. That's my job. And we feel disconnected.
Brian, one thing I've heard a lot lately from teams, a lot of our districts are small, and so their teams are sometimes made up of the same folks. So the same folks are on the tier 1 team as the tier 2 team and the tier 3 team. Wondering if you can just speak quickly about pros of that, cons of that, how to navigate those waters.
The small school I worked with is 5 adults, included the principal and the teachers, everybody, 5 adults. And we said, great, you need to have 4 conversations in your school. And they're like, but it's only the 5 of us. I gotcha. But if we want to work in a multi-tiered logic, there's 4 conversations. And you have to say, I have a cursor somewhere here. What are we doing for tier 1? And then that's a different conversation. That's a separated conversation from what are the tier 2 interventions that we're picking and installing and putting in place and monitoring. And that's a separate conversation from let's problem solve Joe. We provided Joe some support through this process, but we're not sure his needs are being met. So let's figure out what we need to help Joe. And that probably means modifying something for tier 2. And then tier 3 systems. So these are the conversations. And Lori, the spirit of this is sometimes these are the same adults in a small building, or there's a big overlap. 50% of the adults are on multiple teams. If you're in a bigger school, if you have your high schools I don't know how big your high schools are, but let's say they're a little bit bigger, you have an opportunity to get more adults involved. And I'd love to see if you really had all 4 of these conversations in place, then there should be a place for lots of adults to get involved. So that's another way to think about it too. The key is help yourselves. Don't blur these two tier 1 and tier 2 systems conversations together, because you can't do them well if you're not focused on, is this what we want all adults doing for all students? Or are we monitoring the tier 2 interventions that we're picking and installing? If we confuse these conversations and blur them together, we devolve into just talking about individual kids. It always happens. And then we're actually not doing multi-tiered work. We're just doing problem-solving work, one kid at a time. Or we're talking about one adult or one family or a parent or whoever. And that's what happens. And so reflect upon your team meetings and say, well, what does it sound like? Does it sound like we're systems focused, or we're, fidelity intervention monitoring focused for tier 2? Or do all of our conversations really just sound like problem solving individual issues? That'd be another way you might want to think about it. I didn't share the slide. It is in the slide deck though. I didn't share it before. I didn't know if we were going to go there, but thank gosh I put it in, Lori. It's like you set me up. I've gone longer on time, Lori, than I intended, so I'm sorry about that. Lori, anything else from you or any other questions from the group?
No worries, Brian. Thank you so much for sharing your passion, your enthusiasm, and your knowledge. I love your advice to always go back to the basics. Given the disruption that our students and staff has faced, going back to the basics is going to ensure that the right work is done. So thank you for stressing that. And then I also loved the mapping activity. I think most teams have done the mapping work, but the idea of revisiting it, the idea of checking the last time for fidelity and the student data pieces is definitely work that can always be updated, and I think will also direct the right work to be done. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us, Brian.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was great seeing everybody again. I recognize so many of these faces. So wonderful.
Excellent.
Great group.
All right, so let me just preview the rest of the day. So Brian is done, and he's welcome to stay, but he certainly does not have to. We will jump into some breakout rooms. They'll be facilitated by myself and Joe Fantagrossi and Hennessy Lustica, Casey Steiner, and Sandra Orden. And so you'll be thrown in a room with one of them just to process Brian's knowledge that he shared with us. We will, after that, take a break and then come back together at 11 o'clock to learn a little bit more about TFI action planning and how that can connect to the ARCH model. Questions before I open the breakout rooms? All right. I'm opening rooms.